All right, yeah,
All right,
you're good.
so, you guys all ready?
Yeah, you ready? For the first slide? All right, you're good.
So today I'm going to be talking about rational romanticism, which is the idea of merging science and imagination to build the future. All right, so the next 100 years represent the most crucial time in history. Currently, we're facing a lot of existential perils like climate change, infectious disease, catastrophic war that might involve bioterrorism, nuclear weapons, etc. But we possess the tools to save our future. And so by merging science and this romance of the imagination, we can build tomorrow. So just to start off, I'd like to give a nice little illustration, this spider. This spider could perch on the tip of my finger, but she contains more functional components than an aircraft carrier. We have the potential to engineer structures and systems and machines that can rival and even exceed the complexity of this spider. Because as humans, we possess the ability to simulate our designs in our minds, and then to implement those simulations into reality and construct them. All right, so just to give you guys a little bit of background, I'd like to talk about some of the exponential trends in technology. Some of this might already be familiar to many of you, but for those of you who are not familiar, I'm just going to go over some of this stuff to give you a little bit of background, since it is definitely something that, if you're not already familiar with it, can be rather surprising. All right, so exponential trends in technological change are indicating that we may reach a technological singularity at some point in the near future. Some, most notably Raymond Kurzweil, have posited this for 2045, but I would estimate, based on trends in neuroengineering specifically, that it'd be closer perhaps to 2100, just given a conservative estimate. So what is the technological singularity? It's a point in time when technological change, especially change related to the development of engineering intelligence itself, and this may or may not be software-based artificial intelligence, as I'll talk about in a minute, but engineering intelligence itself allows for the construction of machines which can recursively self-improve and lead to an intelligence explosion. And at this point, there would be changes in our lives that are so profound that it would change every aspect of our lives. And things like mind uploading and uploaded astronauts going out and exploring the universe and so on and so forth might become a real possibility. So some evidence for this exponential change. You can see here in a plot modified from Kurzweil's "The Singularity is Near." This is describing the increase in hardware capacity, specifically flops or calculations per second per $1,000. And this is a little out of date because the book was published in 2005, but it's been updated since then. However, this was one of the nicer plots, so I decided to modify this one. Basically, we're reaching the point when, in terms of pure hardware capacity and brute force computation, based on if we're taking neurons as anatomical units that are simplified to the point where it's cellular scale but not molecular scale, we're looking at we're pretty much at the point where we could hypothetically simulate an insect brain. We're reaching the point where we could simulate a mouse brain, and we may be approaching a human brain, especially with exascale computing, depending on how simplified you want to make your neurons. And then the trends are going farther even, and Kurzweil suggests, like I said earlier, that by 2045 we could reach a point where billions of human brains could be simulated in a computer that only costs $1,000. Some other trends are present in nanotechnology. You can see over there the size of mechanical devices. Miniaturization is rapidly increasing as well. The number of nanotechnology patents. And then things in synthetic biology and biotechnology in general, the cost of DNA sequencing, as well as the cost to write DNA, that is to chemically synthesize DNA base pairs and string them together. Usually that happens by a process of doing shorter segments of oligonucleotides and then overlapping them and synthesizing the rest. But I digress. All right. So as I was discussing, the singularity may or may not be driven by non-biological artificial superintelligence. And I would actually propose that it would be ideal for humans and machines to work alongside one another. So just to sort of whimsically describe this, I've outlined a few possible singularities. Cyber singularity would be the more AI-based singularity, purely AI. Neurosingularity would be a singularity that involves neural implants, like this fairly out there diagram that I put together to just sort of illustrate what something like that might look like. And in this way, people and computers would sort of merge together and help each other reach a state of superintelligence. And nanosingularity would involve strong nanotechnology, sort of Drexler's original vision for nanotechnology, in which molecular assemblers and utility fog, the fog of nanomachines that would allow for complex objects to be built on a whim, even self-replicating nanomachines that are obviously controllable so they don't get out of hand would become commonplace. A biosingularity would be more along the lines of biologically based enhancements, but probably most likely it'll be some combination of these things if we reach this point. It'll be some different mix of this. So now that I've given you some background on that, obviously we're facing all these great existential risks, but we also have great opportunities. And if we do this properly, we could reach a cosmic tomorrow. But of course, we do have to avoid things like hostile artificial superintelligence. We have to avoid things like infectious disease and antibiotic resistance running rampant in the meantime. So what will we need to reach this future? And I'm proposing several key components, together I'm calling this rational romanticism. And these include imagination and a sense of wonder, obsessive determination to work towards these goals, communication across STEM and the arts to facilitate cultural support. And I'll be talking about a lot about this later. So right now there's a fair amount of clashing between some of the more humanistic pursuits and the more technical pursuits. And we really need to, in order to make the possibilities of things like human enhancement and these kinds of very radical changes a little bit more palatable, we'll want to help illustrate why we have this passion for them, why it's not necessarily this coldly mechanistic thing. And then, of course, with all of that, we need scientific rigor and we need collaboration, because we can't just come up with all these wild things and then just expect them to happen. We actually have to do the hardcore engineering to make them happen. All right, so to start off, I'll be talking about building the future with visionary engineering. So, as I mentioned earlier, when humans cognitively simulate these abstract possibilities, we can then later implement them. So abstract possibilities with high emotional salience there's some research that shows that these sorts of possibilities are more likely to be realized. Especially, I mean, just consider, like, if you have some sort of goal in mind, some sort of big vision behind what you're doing, you're a lot more likely to stick to it and have that kind of obsessive determination, that kind of drive to really make your vision into reality. And so there's definitely some research to support that this is an important component. It should also be noted that the simulations also must incorporate process, because if you're only including things that are related to if you're only including like the end goal, you're more likely to be disillusioned and to sort of fall off the trail eventually, because you're not going to be taking concrete steps towards these end goals. So you have to have both. So now I'd like to give a couple of examples of what I consider to be visionary engineering. So I recently had the pleasure of Ed Boyden visited CU Boulder recently, and so I got to meet him in person there. I also had the pleasure of meeting some of his grad students at the MIT Media Lab, where his laboratory is located. The MIT Media Lab is a larger organization within MIT that Ed Boyden's lab is a part of. And I had the opportunity to speak with some of his grad students about various topics while I was visiting there, as well as to meet him when he was visiting Boulder. Anyway, so Ed Boyden has stated such things as that he seeks to solve the brain and even map all of biology for engineering purposes. And in some interviews, he's even talked about using this kind of knowledge to eliminate suffering and find existential purpose. Obviously very big goals, very dramatic goals, very great vision there. But at the same time, he has helped to pioneer a lot of technologies that take concrete steps towards these goals. And in particular, just to give a little context, these kinds of things might help towards both neural implants and towards building more human-like machines, and so on and so forth, as well as just for therapeutic purposes like clinical treatment of mental illness and so on and so forth. So some examples are optogenetics, which is a brilliant technology in which neurons are engineered to express ion channels that respond to particular wavelengths of light. And if you use a fiber optic or nanophotonics or something along these lines, you can activate or inhibit certain neurons in the brain simply by applying these pulses of light, assuming that you've engineered the neurons to express the channels. And so this is very useful for both studying the brain and potentially for future interfaces with the brain. Another great technology that he's helped pioneer is expansion microscopy, which you can see a modified figure from one of his papers about it over here. And basically what expansion microscopy does is it uses chemical and electrophoretic treatments to physically expand samples of neural tissue. And the samples of neural tissue, like you could take, for instance, a rat brain and then treat it with this process, and it'll actually get bigger. And then, because of this, it is easier to image using techniques like super resolution microscopy, and you can get very nice high resolution images like this one. And so it's really great because of that. There was something else I was going to say about that, but whatever. Anyway, so another thing that he has innovated is a process called automated patch clamping. And of course, it should be noted that this is his lab is highly collaborative. There's a lot of people involved, so I want to give credit to everyone. There's more than 40 people in his lab alone, and there's also collaborating labs outside. So when I say he, I'm sort of referring to this as the broad he in the sense that he's leading a lot of these efforts, but there's a lot more going on underneath. Anyway, automated patch clamping is very useful because, I was going to say, sorry, about the expansion microscopy, just for mapping the brain and understanding the brain. Obviously, this could take huge leaps towards that, since it may be one of the processes which we use towards developing a full brain wiring diagram. Anyway, back to automated patch clamping. Automated patch clamping is more for studying functional activity in the brain. And in this, Boyden and his collaborators were able to design a robot which uses both two-photon microscopy, which is a special type of fluorescence microscopy, and a patch clamp, which, if you're not already aware, is a method of measuring neural electrical activity from neurons, individual neurons. And so this robot will take a sample of neural tissue, and it will apply the patch clamp and at the same time observe what it's doing using the microscope. And then because the patch clamping device can mechanically perturb the neural tissue, it ends up leading to this, sometimes when human experimenters are doing it, it can be very challenging because it ends up leading to the tissue being shifted around and potentially damaged and so on, and that can get in the way of the measurements. And so what this robot does is it takes images in real time and continuously adjusts for those perturbations in order to rapidly and effectively examine neural activity. And again, this is sort of moving towards understanding the brain, which has all manner of applications, as I have described. So a lot of great stuff going on there. Another example of visionary engineering is the Human Brain Project, which was originally initiated by Henry Markram. He was a South African scientist who started up this Human Brain Project. It was originally called the Blue Brain Project. At this point, it is funded with $1.3 billion. It's one of the 2 European flagship projects, and basically the original goal was simulating a brain in a supercomputer, and Markram has a great TED Talk about that. And so this kind of vision has led to this very large enterprise contributing a lot to our knowledge of neuroscience. And so Basically what it's accomplished so far is it's built, in 2006 there was when it was called Blue Brain Project, it built a 10,000 neuron biologically accurate model of a rat neocortical column. And a cortical column is a unit of neural tissue that has certain circuit motifs that repeat across the cortex. And of course there's some variations as you enter different cortical areas, but it tends to it does tend to exhibit very similar structures as this unit repeats. And so they were able to simulate this 10,000 neuron unit and glean some interesting computational insights from that relative to how it functions. Later on, I think it was 2015, there was a paper, and that's where I pulled this figure from. Well, it was actually several different figures from this paper they put together here just to illustrate. They were able to reconstruct a cortical mesocircuit, which is several cortical columns. This one I think had about 31,000 neurons involved, and simulate that and continue to advance the project. So it should be noted that the Human Brain Project did undergo somewhat recently sort of a shift in direction, because the Human Brain Project was too focused on theoretical and computational methods, and it didn't have enough experimental backup to continue emulating larger and larger neural structures. And so they've been trying to incorporate more of a diversity of different approaches, including more experimental approaches, to gather the necessary wiring data and the necessary functional data to really gain a good idea of how it works biologically before moving on to the simulation aspects. And of course they're still doing some simulation aspects, but it's a little bit more of a broad approach at this point. So while the Human Brain Project may or may not reach the goal of actually simulating a human brain in a supercomputer, it has definitely done an amazing amount to spark off a lot of other projects, like the China Brain Project, the Brain Minds Project. I think the Brain Initiative was likely somewhat inspired by this, since that I believe happened in 2013. I think Brain Minds was in Japan. There's actually several different ones across various countries that had begun this race towards developing computational and sort of fully wired up models of the brain. And a lot of the different contributions from these different projects that are beginning to accelerate may eventually reach that goal of having a whole brain emulation. So now I'm going to shift into another topic. So we've talked about applying these big visions to engineering. I'd like to discuss artistic communication and communicating with the public in order to gain more support for some of these futuristic goals that to many might seem a little frightening at first and somewhat detached from human values. However, as I will describe, it doesn't have to be that way. So unfortunately, the arts and humanities, perhaps I shouldn't have said almost universally, but it definitely is very frequent that the arts and humanities will take kind of a hostile stance towards science and technology. You'll see a lot of news articles as well as a lot of academic articles in the humanities taking a very suspicious perspective on these types of things. I've run across hundreds, if not thousands, of such instances online, as well as just in talking to people. Especially, I was actually at Dartmouth for a while. I'm not there any longer. I'm at CU now, but I was at Dartmouth for a while, and since Dartmouth is a liberal arts college, there were a lot of people who were very suspicious of futuristic ideas, and so even among the faculty. And so and I mean, I've definitely noticed that there is this element of our culture that is kind of unfortunate. And some primary criticisms emerge. Of course, the precautionary principle, this one I'll just touch on briefly, is just the idea that some risks might be too risky to take, especially associated with technology. And to that, I would just counter that with, well, we're facing a lot of existential existential threats right now that are sort of pushing us the other way. It will be, if we are inactive, if we do not take these risks, that in itself is an immense risk and outweighs the risks of taking action through these technologies. There's also some association with greed and oppression that comes, especially with relation to technology, out of some of these humanities publications, which is unfortunate. And that itself sort of stems from the idea that technology is detached from human emotions, that it's somehow this cold, mechanistic monster that's just going to eat everyone. And so, what I'd like to do here is to talk about how we can begin to counter this, and to because as I'm sure many of you are in technology-related fields and science, I mean, there definitely is an emotional side to technology. There is these visions. There's this idea, this very humanistic pursuit of trying to build the future and build a better future and build a future in which our relationship with technology is a positive one. And so we have to communicate that emotional side of technology, the soul of the machine. And some ways that we can do this. So there's speculative poetry and optimistic science fiction, digital humanities, and technology itself is art. Digital humanities is a emerging discipline in which people from the sciences and the humanities cross-pollinate in their methods. And so they're studying things like cultures and history, and they're using scientific methods at the same time. And so there's more of a conversation going on between people from these different disciplines, which is great. And it can help us to understand that, I mean, we're all people who are looking for something. We're all people who are looking towards a better world. And so it kind of humanizes the scientists for the people who might not necessarily think of the scientists as being as emotionally in touch. And then going back to some of the particular artistic things that one can do, there's technology as art itself. I mean, creating technology, that's creating something new. You can design things, you can build things in. You have to consider how the technology will impact the human. It's a very creative pursuit. And I mean, even just aesthetic things in how the technology is designed, even things as simple as creating figures for scientific publications. There's definitely, especially in some of the publications like Frontiers and Nature and Neuron, there's some quite beautiful figures, and that in itself takes a degree of artistic planning and artistic thinking. So anyway, I'm going to be talking a little bit more about speculative poetry and optimistic science fiction. So far as that goes, speculative poetry can include fantasy and sci-fi poetry, but I'm going to be mainly focusing on sci-fi poetry here. So speculative poetry involves just these more imaginative leaps, taking these imaginative leaps in poetry and then bringing these ideas from science and technology into the poems themselves. And sort of the positive emotional resonance that one can bring in if you're writing a more optimistic form of this can really upend the assumption that science and technology has to be separate from emotion, because if you have emotions inherently embedded in the ideas. I mean, you're taking individual words and individual ideas that are commonly associated with the hardcore technical, and you're putting them into a context that is much more literary. You can begin to move towards that emotional resonance. And so, in this example, Vinci Space Opera is a concrete poem, a poem with shape. That you can sort of see a rocket ship here, and it sort of brings the romance of that into it. The red-orange blast of his engines glows like morning, a little harbinger of hope in stormy darkness. Obviously, a very poetic. It is a poem after all. Vinci, just to give a little background, he's a Filipino-American poet who is pretty well known, and he's active in the speculative poetry community as well. And so, bringing this kind of romance into it is very important. It should be noted that there actually already is a fair amount of spacecraft-related romance out there. And so what I'd really like to see is I'd like to see some more poetry that brings in ideas around things like synthetic biology and neuroengineering and artificial intelligence and so on, and nanotechnology. In order to, because I mean these are some of the technologies that are really shaping our future, and of course space travel as well. But I mean, there's definitely a lot of ground to explore, and some of these things are a little more abstract, and so. And I mean, in part because there hasn't been as much focus on describing them through the arts. And so I would definitely say that it's important to bring in these romantic ideas surrounding nanotechnology and synthetic biology and artificial intelligence and neuroengineering, so that we can start to bridge the gap between the sciences and humanities and make this something that humans as a whole are excited about rather than frightened by. So Yeah, all right. So some personal efforts towards building the future. I'm going to talk a little bit about my research and my writing, and sort of tie back to some of the other stuff we've discussed. So, as was mentioned in my introduction by Trent, I've been working on synthetic biology research for about 5 years now. And what I'm aiming to do is combat antibacterial resistance, which is heavily involved, one of those existential threats of infectious disease, using a de novo, not found anywhere in nature, the sequence that is, antimicrobial peptide, which I dubbed OPAL, and a bacterial conjugation delivery system for the gene encoding OPAL. And basically how this works is that I designed this antimicrobial peptide, which is highly hydrophobic, so when it's in the aqueous environment of the cell, it aggregates, it clumps together, and it disrupts bacterial homeostasis, causing chaos in the bacteria, and broadly throwing off their systems in a way that's quite different from traditional antibiotics, which tend to target specific macromolecular target sites, which can easily be changed through mutations. And so this is a new approach to antibiotic resistance, which has potential for making it more difficult for resistance to develop, since it uses this different mechanism that is much broader. And then I also developed this bacterial conjugation delivery system, which basically is bacterial conjugation is a process by which donor bacteria carrying plasmids, conjugative plasmids, which are usually circular pieces of DNA, will transfer the DNA to recipients, and then and in the natural setting or in the environmental setting, the recipient this has actually been taken advantage of by bacteria to spread antibiotic resistance. But here I'm co-opting this in order to transfer the antimicrobial encoding gene to recipient bacteria. And what I've been able to show is that this can kill off a significant portion of the recipient population when you mix together donor bacteria carrying the artificial gene encoding OPAL with the recipients. And just for targeting purposes, I've developed a promoter-based targeting, and that's just basically what that just means is that when the artificial gene is transferred into recipient bacteria, it's turned on once it's in the recipients, but it's not turned on when it's in the donors, so the donors remain unharmed. And this is also good because it could potentially allow us to do less harm to indigenous microbiota in the human body, which is a major issue with traditional antibiotics. So I'm also just starting out with a project in connectomics, trying to understand the brain by mapping the wiring. And I'm developing a nanotechnology-based contrast agent for X-ray tomographic brain mapping. And this might be able to be developed into something that would be biocompatible enough, using things like PEG and such. I won't go into too much detail here, but it might be able to be developed in a way that would allow biocompatibility, so that we could start to map neural structures in living organisms, which could be great for developing neural prostheses that attempt to emulate specific parts of the brain, even down to the point of specific, and this is more of a far-off vision, but even down to the point of specific individual people. You might be able to, for instance, if somebody lost a chunk of their brain, you might be able to, if this person had their brain mapped earlier, you might be able to program a neural prosthesis to emulate that specific chunk based on the mapping that you had done earlier, and then replace the brain. In that sense. And of course, my bigger vision towards this would be towards something like mind uploading, in which you would gradually replace the brain with neural prostheses, and then eventually transition into a neurosingularity style situation where humans and machines merge, and we can go out and explore the universe as uploaded astronauts. And so obviously very far off, but it's something that I'm just beginning to take steps towards, and I'm very excited about. So I also communicate with writing, and I recently, that's not this one, but I recently published a poem in an Australian international publication called Andromeda Spaceways Magazine. And this poem that I wrote is called The Sonata Machine, and it takes this perspective on human evolution and sort of human destiny in the universe, a very romantic perspective of what might happen, and sort of moving towards what in some circles is known as an omega point, in which the entire universe might be saturated with intelligence, and it's it's pretty out there, but I bring it together in a way that is very interesting. And so you can actually find this if you search for the poem online, the Sonata Machine. At least for now, they put up a free PDF of the Andromeda Spaceways issue, so a little self-promotion there, but I like it. I like it. It's pretty cool. Anyway, I'm also working on a sci-fi novel called Arachne. It's currently a draft, and I'm about 2/3 of the way through. And it examines some ideas around around sort of the human condition related to whether humans are inherently good or bad, and how to approach that, as well as sort of moving towards the technological singularity and what might happen at that point and how all these things might interplay. And then also a post-singularity scenario in which some of the inherent psychological challenges, some of the inherent psychological baggage that is brought along from humanity is sort of put to the test and eventually does push through, but it takes some finagling. But anyway, there's some details about that I'm not going to go into right now. I've also got a draft of an epic poem called The Saga of Cabaret, which mainly deals with post-singularity civilizations. It's actually a very whimsical poem. It's romantic in the sense of relationships romance, but it deals with super intelligent aliens, which is fun. And then I've got a lot of other poems, like Neuroweavers, Gorgeous Geometries, Electricologies, and over here, Life Under the Microscope, which a lot of these deal with sort of the romance of things like nanotechnology, things like neuroengineering and synthetic biology and artificial intelligence. I'm not going to read through the whole thing, but Life Under the Microscope here, you can see basically what I've done here is I've used these seething replicators, these inquisitive nanomachines, as a metaphor for the human species itself. They're in these little petri dishes in a lab, and they're replicating, and they're having all of these different events happen to them, microscopic make-out sessions, and harpsichord gasps of pain, and so on and so forth. And I mean, some of these things are good, some of them are bad, but obviously these little machines, they're very emotional. They're going through this evolutionary process, and they're colliding, they're interacting, they're living their lives, and I mean, just like us. And then you zoom out and you see that these petri cultures, they look so small as snowflakes fall outside the lab, and yet at the same time, at the end of the poem, we're left with the sense that despite their smallness, there is vital importance in the experiences and the emotions of these machines, and they have immense potential for becoming something much bigger, and they can bring with them the emotional richness and into that future. And so I just like to leave you with that as I conclude my presentation, because that's what I'm really trying to communicate here. I do have a couple of final remarks just to summarize. To apply rational romanticism to engineering, we're thinking about grand-scale visions in combination with scientific rigor and the obsessive determination that comes from having these visions that you really want to work towards. And then with art and communicating, I'm attempting to encourage a more STEM-friendly culture, which expresses the emotional aspects of technology and its relationship to humanity in a way which can bridge those cultures and allow us to move into the future with the support of with more support from the broader public and from the broader academic community, so that we can really be uninhibited by by some of those interdisciplinary conflicts which are leading to more dystopic visions. And so, yeah, we're really shooting for the stars here, and with that, I'll conclude my presentation, and I'll be open to questions.
When you talk about disrupting homeostasis, are you talking about like creating an osmotic differential or something? Or what's the mechanism?
Yeah, so it's actually mainly based on the aggregation. So there's a variety of different mechanisms which may occur, and I've done some dye-based assays as well as computational simulations to confirm that aggregation is the primary mechanism, as well as I also have a control peptide called opalacitic, which its hydrophobic properties are interrupted by aspartic acid residues, which are placed periodically throughout the peptide. And this control peptide, opalacitic, has far less toxicity. And so primarily the mechanism is based on this very high hydrophobic character, which causes it to aggregate, which can do a variety of things like cause oxidative stress, trap other macromolecules inside of it, use up amino acids since it's overexpressed very high amounts of this peptide, and starve the bacteria and do stress responses and so on and so forth. And I actually did check to, because there is the question, is it bacteriostatic or bactericidal? And it is bactericidal. There was some question over that because sometimes there are promoter mutations, which is one limitation, but there's promoter mutations which can happen. And so sometimes if you have a large population of just one, of a monoculture of bacteria, there can be outgrowth from the ones in which the promoter, which turns on the gene, is defective. However, if you have a competitive scenario in which there's donor bacteria and recipient bacteria competing, this isn't as much of an issue. But anyway, it is a bactericidal peptide which operates primarily by an aggregative mechanism. If you're curious, I can talk to you more about that afterwards. Other questions?
Can you solicit feedback, that's just like from the state from university communities and the sciences to see kind of what the reaction is to something like this?
Yeah. So I was actually when I was at Dartmouth, I was part of a creative writing club called Humbug, and it definitely does take some degree of it takes some degree of getting used to still with things like the Sonata machine and things like Life Under the Microscope. But I actually, since I was in this club for a while, I was actually sort of able to show people who initially were a little bit resistant to the ideas around transhumanism that it does have this more soulful component, and so those folks, while it did take a little bit of it did take some time and some exposure to various different pieces, but I definitely feel that they definitely began to more understand where I was coming from with that, which was really great. And so far as people in the sciences go, I mean, people in the sciences usually like my poetry, other questions?
What's the risk in the long term of mind control?
Mind control.
Of everybody being like a uniform one person?
Yeah. So that's definitely because I mean that's like the idea of you're essentially, I mean, you're getting rid of things like infectious disease and nuclear war, at least, and resource scarcity, but you're making cybersecurity much more of a priority there. And I mean, right now we see things like there's been a lot of companies, like I think there was Target, and there were a few others that have been hacked recently, and so I mean that's definitely a major concern. However, I mean, one of the things that we have to consider here is that we are sort of in this transition period. We're in this period where a few years ago these things weren't a concern at all, and so there wasn't as much research out there on trying to develop defenses against these things. And I mean, sure, yes, people, the hackers will develop better attacks, the cybersecurity experts will develop better defenses, but I mean, I do think that given that the hackers will inherently be fringe, there are ways, and I mean, just given, I mean, I've met so many people who are so innovative and so good at these kinds of things. I know a guy in high school named Stephen Parrish who was developing network security protocols for networks of computers, which could help prevent the spread of computer viruses over different networks. And I mean, I didn't fully understand it because I don't come from a computer science background, but he obviously was very good at what he did, and I think he might be associated. He might be working for the government now or something like that. But or I don't know. His family has had sort of an association for a while with some of those organizations, but. Anyway, like just people like him and people like, I also knew a guy named Elliot Gorkowski who did some really great stuff with something called the, I don't know if it's pronounced SAT or SAT algorithm, but there's just so many innovative people out there. And so I think that once we start to realize and make this a priority, it definitely will become more feasible to stay ahead of hackers who might try to infect our brains. I mean, there's also the matter of like considering hardware, because I mean, you can put hard blocks down by just disconnecting things, and having systems in place that allow for those kinds of disconnections to be made when in emergencies. And so, just sort of to summarize, I would definitely say that it is a concern, but it's not an insurmountable concern. There's a lot of intelligent people out there who are working on this kind of thing, and we're moving towards a time when it's going to be more recognized as a priority in which we can really start to overcome those issues.
What's your take on the flat earthers and moon hoaxers that seem to be of the millennial generation that are popping up all over YouTube?
Yes, the flat earthers. I don't know. I wasn't aware that they had a particularly high following among millennials, but perhaps. But anyway, the flat earther thing, I mean, that kind of thing comes up, and I mean, we're definitely at a period of time when there is a lot of change. There's a lot of unsettlement among people. There was a guy, I was at something called the Envision conference recently at Princeton. There was a guy named Peter Turchin who developed this field. It's actually might be considered a digital humanities field called cliodynamics, which applies dynamical systems mathematics to the study of history. And what he found was that we're kind of in the middle of a period of time. Basically he found that there's these oscillations throughout history of stability and instability, and we're kind of in the middle of one of the more unstable periods. And so I definitely would say that things like flat earthers, things like a lot of people being scared and coming up with these sort of out there conspiracy theories, that's definitely going to be more frequent during these periods of time. But that still is something that we can overcome. And hopefully, if we play our cards right, we'll be able to get through this next period of instability and reach some of these really radical technological transformations, which could help to sort of change the overall landscape and prevent a lot of those existential risks that might arise, particularly as being contributed to by instability. We can really start to move past that. And so I do think that this is kind of a point at, we're definitely moving through something, and it's kind of rough and choppy at this point, but that's something that we can get past. Did you have a question?
Yeah, I was going to ask, of the existential risks that you mentioned earlier, if applying this romantic rationalism, if this were to continue to work to ensure that this becomes more of a wider society-wide and cultural mindset shift in the application of both the science and the arts, of those existential risks, which do you think we would have the most powerful impact against?
Interesting. I think that for one thing, I guess it kind of depends on your perspective, because when it comes to things like sort of this merger with technology, obviously diseases would be less of an issue because it would just become a non-issue, because we would have a different set of diseases, and hopefully ones that we'd be able to deal better with because we had built the systems. But at the same time, I think that resource consumption will be, and sort of all the things that spawn off of resource consumption will probably be one of the most crucial things that we can deal with, because obviously computer hardware still does take resources, but it's a very specific type of resource, and you can much more sort of compress the processes and systematize the processes that would be necessary to acquire the processing resources to build virtual worlds and so on and so forth. And so if we lived in this kind of society, a lot of the conflicts and a lot of the starvation, a lot of the disease, a lot of the overcrowding effects would become far less of an issue, because we would have these very straightforward mechanisms of acquiring resources, and likely resources, especially if we improve our hardware processing speed continues to improve very, very rapidly, likely these even fairly small amounts of resources would give rise to much larger environments, and we wouldn't need to devote huge swaths of land to farming feedstock for animals, which and huge swaths of land to farming feedstock for humans, and so on and so forth. And we would be able to devote a lot more resources towards things that are more crucial in the kind of society where we would no longer be human in the sense of our bodies, but we would still be human in the sense of carrying over our intrinsic values.
So, in the future, 2100, what would a day-to-day life be like? What do you imagine it looking like?
Yeah, so I mean, obviously I can't say with any degree of certainty, but just to speculate a little, I would imagine that likely there would be sort of a situation in which 2100 might be a little early for all of this, but just maybe 2150, 2200, something along those lines. We might no longer have planet Earth as we know it, but the environments and the minds on planet Earth would be preserved in a simulated world, which would allow us to have a greater degree of control over preventing suffering in its various capacities. And so people might be able to, people of course in a simulated world, I mean this would be essentially, I don't know if any of you are familiar with San Junipero, but it was the one optimistic Black Mirror episode, and it would be something kind of along those lines, in which we would have this environment that we could live in, and we could be creative in, and we could dream in, and we would have this kind of virtual environment. And then at the same time, because we're human and because we carry with us a spirit of exploration, we would also have access to actuators externally that would allow us to be exploring other worlds and going to Jupiter and investigating and maybe even meeting other life forms at some point, although there's a great deal of contention over how frequent alien life forms might be in the universe. But we could sort of spread out across the universe and continue to innovate and discover and change and grow. And at the same time, we would have this home base that would be that would be under a lot more that would be a lot more engineerable, because if we've engineered the entire system, we'll be capable of preventing things like, I mean, even obviously this is a little bit of an unusual perspective, but I've already brought a lot of unusual perspectives. We'd be able to prevent things like wild animal suffering, which oftentimes is kind of overlooked. I mean, it's because people assume that it's just okay just because it's natural, but because it happens and it's always happened. But just because something's always happened doesn't mean that it's good. I mean, there's still animals out there who are suffering, and obviously a more pressing current issue would be animal suffering at human hands, but I think that both are definitely priorities eventually. And so things like wild animal suffering, because there's a lot of suffering in the environment that's, I mean, it's really painful to think about. Things like that could be removed while still preserving animal minds. I don't know if any of you are familiar with David Pearce, but he's a philosopher. I think he co-founded the World Transhumanist Association, or I should know what this is called, but anyway. David Pearce has written an online manifesto called The Hedonistic Imperative, perhaps a little bit ominously titled, but it's actually a lot more. It's a lot more in touch than it sounds from the title, which is basically just the idea that suffering itself is inherently a bad thing, and it would be good if we could engineer it away. And of course, we want to avoid those scenarios in which we accidentally cause more harm than good, and so we want to not do that prematurely. But once we have the ability, we would have a moral imperative to remove this kind of suffering and replace it with something that still operates along a gradient. So, of course, if you have sort of a flat line of emotion, if you're just always exactly this happy all the time, you're not going to have much motivation to do things. But if you simply, but what Pearce proposes is instead you would shift what is considered the hedonic baseline upwards to a great degree. And so you would still fluctuate around that baseline, and you could pursue things and aim higher and be sort of in a hyperdrive state that would allow you to really still pursue constructive goals, but at the same time, what we would now consider to be what we would now consider to be normal would be very different there. It would be a much more pleasant state, a much more fulfilled state, and then you could simply move upwards further and then fluctuate around that baseline. So my vision for the next 100 to 200 years is that yes, we would convert entire planets into simulated worlds, and we would be able to eliminate suffering while at the same time still preserving the spirit of exploration. And beyond that, something like what I describe in the poem The Sonata Machine, which is where sort of the entire universe has reached a state, and I forgive me for using this poem appears in this term appears in the poem, which is a little bit of a woo term, but I think it describes it well, a technological nirvana kind of state. And that would be even beyond what I was describing there, and that's sort of the ultimate dream. And then at that point, I mean, who knows? Maybe we would create a new universe and start over, which I know sounds pretty wild and out there, and I mean, I can't say for certain that something like this would happen, but I do think that it's a possibility, and it may even be a possibility that it's inevitable, but we don't know enough about physics to say for sure yet, which is what sort of separates us who are talking about this kind of omega point, this kind of technological nirvana, from people who just sort of posit that this thing just is, and it must be, because I mean, we don't know for sure, but we'd like it to be, and we can aim for that goal. And so it's a little distinct from what you might imagine as a little bit more of a new agey style thing, because you're bringing in that sort of idea of uncertainty while still shooting for it. So yeah, sorry, that was kind of a rambling answer, but that's sort of my vision for those kinds of things. And yeah, other questions?
In the brain mapping project, or whatever, has anybody looked for or stumbled across the communication avenue or whatever of prayer?
Of prayer? Not to my sorry, did you have anything?
Yeah, well, I mean, has that even been thought about? How does our brain communicate with the spirit?
Okay. Not to my knowledge has that been investigated specifically, at least in the context of these more systematic brain mapping projects. I do think that, and I'm not super familiar with this research, but I do think that there has been some research that investigates spiritual experiences and on a more macro scale, fMRI style level. I'm not familiar with the particular results though, so you'd have to look into that. I would imagine that kind of, I mean this does bring personal biases. I would imagine that kind of thing may or may not be directly tied to something along those lines. Personally, I sort of follow the idea of existentialism, which is the idea that, at least given a certain take on it, it's the idea that, and there are other takes on it, but it's sort of the idea that the emotion itself gives inherent meaning, and there may or may not be some larger structure, but the emotion itself is sort of the larger structure in a way. It's the emotion is itself the universal property that arises from physics that gives meaning, and so things like building systems that have more positive emotions is inherently meaningful from that perspective, because it would allow you to engineer those states that are more inherently intrinsically meaningful. So coming from that perspective, obviously I'm a little less on the end of what you might think of as traditional religions that use prayer as a method, and so so I'm not sure exactly whether that would lead to what you're proposing or not, but I guess I just encourage you to look into the specific results of the research, because I don't know a huge amount about the subject, so but I do know that there is some more macro level imaging research out there that describes some of those things. There's also some interesting stuff. Some people are interested in, not me personally, but some people are interested in certain psychedelics like ayahuasca as a method of sort of spiritual communication and sort of getting in touch with spirituality. And this, and I know there's been a fair amount of neuroscience research on that, especially recently, so that might also be something you're interested in. Again, I'm actually not interested in psychedelics for that purpose. I personally think that they're too imprecise of a method to achieve the kinds of states that I would personally be looking for, but I'll leave it open to others to decide for themselves about that kind of thing. Anything else? Trent?
Yeah, so Neil Stephenson has criticized the wider community of science fiction authors for their turn towards dystopianism and producing work that's way more pessimistic than it used to be. Do you agree with this assessment, and could you give some recommendations for more optimistic science fiction?
Yes, Yes, I do agree with his assessment that there has been this unfortunate trend, which in some ways reflects the instability of the time, as I mentioned with Cleodynamics and such. I do think that there has been this trend. It's also sort of a long tradition in sci-fi that, starting probably with Frankenstein, maybe even some earlier works, to sort of approach this science gone awry, because it's a very easy plot to fall back on. I mean, it's very easy to write a story about that and then to and then to be like, oh yeah, I've written a deep story because it has a lesson. But I mean, sorry if any of you guys have done something like that. But anyway, I don't know. Personally, I'm not a huge fan of it. Yeah, I agree. So far as more optimistic sci-fi, well, obviously there's Star Trek. It's a little bit of a softer sci-fi, but that's definitely more optimistic. And then so far as other sci-fi, Arthur C. Clarke writes some great sci-fi that really brings in a sense of wonder. Then there's also Ted Chiang. He was the person who wrote the original short story entitled Stories of Your Life, or Story of Your Life. Sorry, because in the anthology it's Stories of Your Life and Others. But anyway, Ted Chiang is actually a really brilliant and to some degree under-recognized sci-fi author who writes these very resonant, very interesting takes on different subjects, and some of them are more fantasy related, but a lot of them are very sci-fi related, and he seems to be very up on a lot of things, and he takes a more balanced view of technology and doesn't necessarily just use it as a vehicle for moralistic lessons. He just sort of examines the future from the lens of, we have these technologies and this is some of the interesting things that could happen, but he doesn't as often take that sort of judgmental stance on it, and he more explores the meaning behind human relationships in the context rather than as some sort of negative thing associated with technology. And yeah, he wrote a anthology, short story anthology collection called Stories of Your Life and Others. The title story, called Story of Your Life, became the movie Arrival, in which people were communicating with aliens, and I actually didn't realize that Arrival was that story until I started watching the movie, and I was like, hey, this is exactly like that short story. And then as it turned out, yep, that's where it came from. So yeah, I'm really glad that actually got that kind of recognition, because like I said, I think he's kind of an under-recognized sci-fi author, and it was great that it got out there that way. But he has a lot of other really great stories. I'm currently reading a sort of a novella-length text by him called, what is it called? You know what? Oh yes, The Life Cycle of Software Objects, which is about artificial intelligence and raising it as like a world in which people are raising artificial intelligent entities as children, and then like sort of almost marketing them as pets. And I haven't gotten all the way through it, but it definitely seems to be it's definitely a very interesting idea, and sort of the idea of moving along of developmental psychology in combination with artificial intelligence has been more of a thing lately, and there's been some research about that kind of thing, and I mean, we definitely might be approaching that kind of realm. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of other great examples, but there's actually this website called I don't remember the exact name, but it gives some good lists, but see, if I can't tell you what the name is, it's not very helpful. But anyway, just one more, Greg, that one's a little pessimistic. Greg Bear. Greg Egan does some interesting stuff. It's very more on the hard sci-fi, like very hard sci-fi level, where it's like just more looking at this is cool kind of thing. But Greg Egan does some interesting stuff, especially related to singularity-related things. And so, yes, all some great sci-fi authors. Kim Stanley, if you're looking for more of a societal, governmental point of view, Kim Stanley Robinson, he's perhaps most well known for his Mars trilogy, wrote a very, very dense but very interesting trilogy of books about terraforming Mars that gets into all kinds of scientific and geopolitical and psychological and just everything. I mean, they're not insanely long books. They're like maybe 500, 600 pages with fairly small print, which, I mean, in the world of books, that can be, that's pretty long, but it's not as long as it could be. But he packs a lot into that. I mean, a lot. So, yeah, lots of good stuff out there. I definitely think it's more prevalent for sci-fi to have strong, to have more optimistic takes in sci-fi that is written rather than film. And I'm hoping that can change soon. So anyway, yeah, lots of great work out there.
Let's give Logan a big round. Just a real quick announcement here. If you or anybody you know is looking for office space, we've actually done a really terrific job here at the Da Vinci Institute. We're graduating some of our companies that are outgrowing our space here, so they're moving into their own space. So if you know anybody that's looking for space, we have about four or five openings right now, so let us know, and we'd love to talk to you. Roger's the contact guy on that. He'll be glad to give anybody a tour, and so they're coming up real soon. So thank you all for coming, and thanks Logan for a terrific presentation.
And stick around and have a cup of coffee and hang out a little bit, and then have a nice night.
I noticed it went dark after a while. It doesn't mean that it's, hopefully it's still recording.
Yeah. Still going, see?
Okay, goody.